Furlough stars Tessa Thompson as a prison guard who is tasked with escorting prisoner Melissa Leo to visit her dying mother. Thompson is young and eager for promotion and determined to take this assignment very seriously. Leo is excited to be out in the world after so long, and we're never sure if she's going to try to make things difficult for Thompson or if she's just enjoying the time she has out. These are two good actresses turning in two good performances in a film that is a little obviously scripted. The ending in particular, the climactic moment of the story, is a little too easy and too sweet to come out of the story that came before it. But Thompson and Leo both make this believable on the whole, and let us root for both of them at alternate moments. Interestingly, this is almost entirely a story about relationships rather than any kind of comment on the prison industrial system, aside from a very brief comment from Thompson's sister at the beginning asking her how she can be part of the system. It's a little awkward that that's brought up and then never really addressed again, but this isn't really a prison movie, it's a buddy movie, and while it's not amazing, it mostly does what it's trying to do. Ivan's Childhood is a very early Andrei Tarkovsky movie about a young boy who works as an informant during a war. We follow him and various other people around him as they navigate the conflict. So Tarkovsky and I are usually not a very good fit. I get very impatient with his meandering philosophical dialogue and his multi-minute long shots. This film of his is early enough that he hasn't fully grown into his style yet, and as such, it doesn't have a lot of the things that turn me off of the other works in his filmography. It's a pretty straightforward story, edited together pretty concisely, and the characters speak about what's actually relevant in the moment instead of ruminating on abstract concepts. So I found the first half of it pretty engaging, especially watching the relationship between young Ivan and the soldiers he works with. It does flag a bit for me in the second half, but for anyone who's had a tough time getting into Tarkovsky like I have, this might be a good bridge to getting into his other work. With Byrd at the South Pole is an early documentary following, well, exactly what the title suggests, Admiral Byrd's expedition to the South Pole. As makes sense with the technology of the time, it's mostly silent footage, with a voiceover explaining what's going on, what the explorers are looking for, how they're doing their research, and what their plans are when things go wrong. There's something historically fascinating about documenting such early exploration of such a remote place in the early days of film. It feels almost like something that shouldn't exist. As far as the narrative or historical information conveyed through the documentary, it's fine, it's thorough. We get to see all the different precautions they had to take to be able to go beyond their base and how they studied the wildlife around them, and even a time or two where something went extremely wrong. Stories like this have been told since then, so the connection I had to it now was very much like going to a museum and realizing, having that sense that the artifacts you're looking at actually came from an era of history that seems long gone. It's definitely an interesting watch because of that. A Stranger Among Us is a Sidney Lumet film about a female police detective investigating a murder in a Hasidic Jewish community. Since she expects one of the community members to be the murderer, she works with the rabbi to go undercover and live among the community in the hopes of solving the mystery. Along the way, she learns more about their customs, their beliefs, and even starts to develop some feelings for one of them. This felt to me like it was trying to be a slight variation on the movie Witness, but it wasn't done nearly as well. Our protagonist is extremely unlikable, not only in her flippant disregard for an entire community's beliefs and rituals, but also in her extremely bad decision-making as she's trying to pass herself off as one of them. She just comes across as not very intelligent and exceptionally bad at her job, and while we are supposed to see her as hot-headed, I don't think we're supposed to see her as stupid. The movie does have some interesting scenes that talk about living in a space distinctly set apart from the culture and what makes that worth doing, but it's all filtered through this incredibly unrelatable protagonist, which makes it difficult to get anything out of. Come On stars Joaquin Phoenix as a radio podcast journalist who ends up caring for his young nephew while Phoenix's sister tries to persuade her mentally ill husband to get help. The boy follows Phoenix around as he travels, interviewing children and teenagers about how they see the world, and the two form a bond. I'm a little startled that this didn't get many Oscar nods, as it feels like the absolute height of solid Oscar bait. And that isn't meant as an insult or to be dismissive, it's mostly a compliment. It means all the pieces of this work well together, and I feel that there's something to be gotten here, but ultimately it isn't for me. Maybe it's that I'm already tired of the trope of child teaches middle-aged white man about life, and it's hard for me to pull out what makes this one better than the rest, if in fact it is. I don't really have any qualms with it, I just don't think anything about it at all, and that makes it incredibly difficult to review. For me, it's just kind of there. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is an HBO TV movie about the Wounded Knee Massacre. It follows several of the involved Native Americans, as well as the government entities who continually go back on their promises. I'll be honest, this is a part of history that I don't know much about, although I have over the years picked up more information about all the horrible things the United States did to those who lived here. This movie, based on the book of the same name, does a great job of setting the scene and showing all the different moving parts that led to this horrible mass murder. I definitely appreciated that most of the story was told from the Native perspective, rather than primarily centering the white people who were responsible for the atrocities. The film doesn't always nicely balance the smaller personal stories with the bigger political ones. They feel like they're part of different films. The romance and the personal advancement of the young Native boy sent to white schools versus the constant negotiation of treaties. Of course, they do connect, but they have very different emotional tones, and I found it difficult to switch between them. Overall, though, I would say this is an extremely solid and well-told adaptation of a story that it is important to continue telling. The Palm Beach Story is a screwball comedy by Preston Sturges about a woman who decides everyone would be better off if she and her husband divorced and she found a wealthy man to marry, and maybe even to help financially support her then ex. She doesn't want to leave her husband, but their financial woes have been putting a strain on their relationship, so off she goes, and off he goes after her to try to convince her not to. This lands much more solidly for me than a lot of Sturges' work does. The stakes still seem relatively light, even within the world of the comedy itself, and it definitely meanders more than I like, but I did smile a lot at the sort of quirky resignation Claudette Colbert brings to the character of the wife. I still can't pinpoint exactly what it is that keeps Sturges' films at an emotional distance from me, but there's less of that here than there usually is, and as a result, I had a pretty good time, and would recommend it to anyone who's a fan of the screwball comedy genre. The Divorcee stars Norma Shearer as a woman who responds in kind when her husband cheats on her by cheating on him. They split apart and she pursues an old flame, another married man. The vengeful back and forth of this story is kind of exhausting to watch, and neither party seems particularly likable. Shearer brings a bit more humanity to her character, especially since she's the first to be wronged in the story, but there's still so much petty digging that I just didn't enjoy it, and I just couldn't get invested in either of the characters' love lives, much less in the side characters they get involved with along the way. It probably didn't help that I watched this at around the same time as the Palm Beach Story, which features, weirdly enough, another woman, also named Jerry, getting a divorce from her husband. But while Palm Beach Story was a comedy, and definitely had a few good moments, The Divorcee is a drama that doesn't work nearly as well for me in this story setting. My Reputation stars Barbara Stanwyck as Jessica Drummond, a widow who finds that the life she wants to live after her husband's death clashes with the rigid social mores expected of her. The romance being told in this movie is kind of an odd one, with the male lead being framed in such a way that I couldn't tell if I was actually supposed to root for them to get together or not. I think ultimately it doesn't matter as much whether I like him as it does whether I like her, and want her to be able to pursue the life she wants. Stanwyck does a good job of showing us both the serious, devoted mother and the unexpectedly single woman who wants to be able to pursue love again. That definitely gives us some good scenes, and I think the movie tackles some interesting questions being raised about how useful social traditions are in the face of individual lives. But despite those good moments, overall, it feels kind of long and plodding and isn't one I'd watch again. Whoopee is a musical comedy starring Eddie Cantor as a hypochondriac in the Old West, who is roped into helping a young woman escape her arranged marriage. Her father won't let her marry the man she wants to marry because he's part Native American, so she asks Cantor to help her escape, and hijinks ensue. This was such an unfortunate film because I was thoroughly enjoying it up until about the hour mark. Its style of dance and song and comedy are definitely dated in style, but I was loving it, and those dance numbers were astonishingly beautiful at times. And then for basically the entire last half hour of the film, we get Cantor first in blackface and then in redface. And it's one of the most uncomfortable, unpleasant juxtapositions I've seen. It really brings the whole film down. The last third is just racial stereotypes exploited for laughs. The first hour had its share of problematic moments, but they weren't the centerpiece of an entire act. I may still watch some of those early dance numbers again out of context, but the movie itself is not worth a rewatch on the whole. It really lost its way, and it never regained it. Union Pacific tells the story of building a railroad line across the country to reach California. There are two competing lines that are allowed to continue building up until they meet with each other, and so an unscrupulous businessman decides to sabotage one line so the other will be able to build more. We followed these efforts, as well as the man who's trying to stop them, and the postmistress of the railroad who's caught in between. This is a Cecil B. DeMille film, and it definitely feels grand and expensive the way many of his films did. Some of the railway laying scenes were unexpectedly compelling, a close look at everything that went into making transport across the country possible. I also found myself unexpectedly caught up in the love triangle between Barbara Stanwyck and the two men on opposite sides who love her. Both of them are portrayed sympathetically, so it's not as simple as good guy versus bad guy, which makes it so much more interesting. It's not like a stellar movie, but it did draw me in much more than I would have expected when I first started this. An interesting look at an exciting time in our history. The Power of the Dog is a Western directed by Jane Campion about a woman who marries a rancher and then has to respond to the personality clashes of her unfriendly, often cruel brother-in-law and her less masculine son that he incessantly mocks. I watched The Piano by Jane Campion last year and didn't fully grasp it. Even when I knew what it was trying to do, it didn't really work for me. This one's a different story. There's an almost visceral, creeping tension to it. Everything just feels off. Benedict Cumberbatch is very unsettling in this, but the film also does a really interesting job of making its characters not entirely good or bad, but really truly flawed people, even as the people around them are quick to ascribe those full good, full bad labels to them. I frequently dislike Westerns because I feel like they all follow the same formula, but this one really goes in different directions every time I think I know what it's going to be doing next. After TikTok had loud opinions about me not liking The Piano, I definitely wanted to give Campion's work another try, and I'm glad for the opportunity to watch this one. It made me more interested in seeking out her other works in the future. Remember the Night stars Fred MacMurray as a prosecuting attorney and Barbara Stanwyck as the petty thief he's prosecuting right before Christmas. Sensing in the judge a streak of Christmas goodwill, he successfully moves to postpone the trial until after the holidays. He feels bad, however, about Stanwyck being stuck in jail throughout the holidays and so offers to pay her bail. Upon finding out she doesn't have anywhere to go, he invites her home to visit his family in Indiana for one last holiday before she's locked up. This is a weirdly sweet little Christmas movie that's a little jarring, considering I most know this pairing from their work in Double Indemnity, which is definitely less than sweet. Unfortunately, once they've established this sort of unorthodox dynamic, the rest of the movie plays out much more like a typical romance. The ending does go in a slightly different direction than I expected, but thinking back on it, that's really the only part that took any chances with the story. It's probably still worth seeing, especially if you're a fan of either of the stars, but it didn't blow me away the way that I hoped it might. Sarah and Son tells the story of an opera singer whose husband sells their baby to a rich couple in a desperate bid for money. She spends the next several years trying to find the child, as well as trying to make her way in the world as a singer. The lead actress was nominated for an Academy Award for this role, but she really didn't do much for me. The 1930s definitely was still leaning into the overacting, melodramatic style of performing, and she has this in spades, more so than anyone else in the film. One article I read compared her performance here to Greta Garbo's in Anna Christie, but the performance here is miles less believable. I'm usually able to kind of relax into that style, but here there were so many moments where she would begin a devastated monologue and I would just start laughing. It's an interesting concept for a movie, and it's scripted and paced pretty well, and if the rest of the cast had been following the same sort of melodramatic style, I might have been able to get into it more. As it is, though, it's a very tough watch for me to engage with emotionally, and I'm sure I'm not going to remember this for very long. The French Dispatch is Wes Anderson's new movie, and boy is it a Wes Anderson movie. There's not a lot of plot to it. It's a sort of visual representation of an edition of a fictional magazine. So we see the various stories and editorials dramatized for the screen with all the big colors and stylized tableaus and half-animated sequences that give Anderson such a distinctive visual style. I feel about this much the same way as I felt about the Grand Budapest Hotel, in that I had an absolutely delightful time watching it, but the story itself is so insubstantial and so episodic, and the style so linked to Anderson as a filmmaker rather than to the core of the story or the narrative, that it's almost impossible to remember as an entity in itself. It's just another chapter in Anderson's film history, and it isn't set apart from Anderson's other work in any meaningful way. That doesn't mean it's a bad film. There are plenty of filmmakers who make basically the same film over and over again who I deeply love, but I suspect I will be left with the same lingering, vague feelings of fondness for this as I do for Grand Budapest Hotel or Moonrise Kingdom or most other efforts by Anderson. L'Âge d'Or is a Luis Buñuel film, which means it's surrealist and experimental and avant-garde, and definitely not my vibe. There are definitely some moments of narrative throughout, but mostly it's sort of a visual, artistic interpretation of the evils of excess and greed and abundance. Unlike some other Buñuel films, there aren't really any images here that held on to me past the credits rolling. They all definitely contributed to an atmospheric sense of decadence, but none of them made a distinct mark on me. I wonder sometimes if excesses of the wealthy is a theme that just doesn't sit well with me. There are a host of films in classic cinema that deal with this theme, and many of them are light on narrative, and I don't know whether it's that lack of narrative or the theme itself that fails to connect with me on any level. Regardless, I'm happy to say this is an important film, and it's one that I'm glad to have seen for my own film literacy, but it's not one that I particularly cared for, and it's not one that I could see myself ever revisiting.